I would like to welcome folks to the very first Climate Care and Community series. Today we're talking about net metering. So this program or policy is a local renewable energy incentive. We're talking about it with esteemed guests from the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, Homer Electric Association, and Golden Valley Electric Association, as well as the Alaska Energy Transparency Project. So this is a really technical topic and it can get in the weeds really quickly. That said, if you have any questions, any comments, then please direct them to the question and answer box that will be right in the middle of the bottom function bar. Yeah. So near the end, like from 140 to 155, I'll be vocalizing as many of these questions as I can until we run out of time. And a couple things to note. We'll be recording today's event for future use. We'll be starting in just a few minutes once an audience has arrived. In the meantime, please do enjoy what I wish was elevator music. And we'll be starting shortly in a couple minutes.
Hey everyone, this is Kengo. I'm going to be doing tech support for the call. If you're a panelist, could I please ask you to mute yourself when you're not talking, just to cut down on the excess noise? Thank you.
Thank you all for attending and making time in your day to join us for this really exciting, really nerdy topic. Alrighty, Rue. All right, let's get started. So moving to the next slide, we're going to start off with a land acknowledgement. Now, the purpose of a land acknowledgement is to recognize the indigenous peoples who live here and have lived here for time immemorial. It's really to recognize that we're on the unceded traditional territory of indigenous peoples across Alaska and in fact across the world and the US. Knowing that this land has never been surrendered to Russia or the United States, we can understand that we owe a lot of gratitude to the communities who have stewarded and cared for the land that we live on now. Yeah, so generations before any of us got here, and these people who are still here are still working to continue this stewardship. And even though colonization has historically really done a number on these lands, waters, and air, and is now a direct effect of climate change. Even though we aren't at fault for that, we are now at the responsibility for bringing that chapter to a close. So that's what we're talking about today. A really the purpose we're here moving forward is so that we can figure out ways that we can get into climate change and change that in small topics. So would you go to the next slide? Thank you. Welcome to the Climate Caring Community Series. This series was thought of because a lot of climate topics aren't really accessible to the people who are most impacted by climate change. And in fact, not accessible to the public in general. Usually we have these conversations with our friends on Facebook or in private with very little like ability to engage with as a whole community. So that's the purpose of our series in general. The purpose of today's topic, net metering, is to really get into how this policy affects us very locally. Yeah, so I'm really excited, as you can tell, I'm sure. Let us move forward. We're going to start today off with Chris Pike. If you go to the next slide. 10-minute presentation from Chris Pike of ACEP, then a 20-minute panel discussion, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A for the audience, and then 5 to 10 minutes of the Chugach Electric voting information, and Ben Betker will present on the Alaska Energy Transparency Project. Now, this is a general outline. I suspect some of these may take more time than others, so we're going to be flexible on this. All right, so let's take it away with Chris Pike. With the next slide, you can see he's with Alaska Center for Energy, the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. He's a primetime person for information as a research engineer, and he's worked with the Alaska Center on a lot of things, including the Solarize project. So I'm very excited for him to take it away.
Thanks, Shanelle. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, perfect. So yeah, as Shanelle said, my name is Chris Pike. I'm with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, or ACEP as we're commonly known. ACEP is an applied energy research center based out of the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. However, we do have a robust office here in Anchorage and even in Juneau. Our Anchorage office has 4 full-time employees, and we're always hosting interns and other researchers as well. And we're co-located with ICER at UAA, the Institute for Social and Economic Research. I'm part of the Solar Technologies program at ACEP, which is where some of this work that I'll be presenting comes from. And I'll just kind of be talking quickly about some of the basics of net metering. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So net metering was approved by the RCA in Alaska in 2009, and it went into effect at the beginning of the following year. And essentially what net metering is it's a way for way for customers that want to install small renewable energy systems to use the grid as a battery and get retail credit for renewable energy that they produce. Sometimes people will refer to it as net billing, because really it's a way of billing. But if you think about it, what happens is you have a bidirectional meter at the location of the renewable energy system, and that meter will record how much energy is purchased from the grid by the customer, and then how much energy is sent from the customer to the grid. And at the end of each month, or at the end of each billing period, that amount is netted out. If you can imagine a system where there was no net metering, what would happen is anytime that the renewable energy system was producing more than the building was consuming, you would have energy flowing onto the grid, and the customer would be compensated for something called the avoided power cost. Generally, depending upon the utility, that ranges from about 2.5 cents up to maybe 13 cents, but that changes quarterly. So obviously this improves the economics for small renewable energy, for residents and businesses that own renewable energy systems. Some of the caveats for net metering on the Railbelt is it is only applicable for the larger utilities. That doesn't really work with the small utilities and the small microgrids in Western Alaska and around the rest of Alaska. The maximum renewable energy size is 25 kilowatts, and utilities are only required to allow net metered customers until the installed capacity of their renewable energy equals 1.5% of the average load of that utility. So if you think about that, think about the amount of kilowatt hours sold in a year, divide that by the number of hours in a year, so 8,760, and then 1.5% of that amount. There's a couple of asterisks there because, as I'll touch on later, a couple of the utilities have approved for and received clearance to raise that 1.5% to 3%. Next slide, please. So here's how net metering looks from a billing perspective. This is a customer who is on the MLNP grid. You can see that this is for the month of April and May of this year when it was quite sunny. And you can see that they bought 172 kilowatt hours of, up in the top right there, of energy from the grid. However, then they sent 330 kilowatt hours to the grid. And this equates to a net of over 158 kilowatt hours. And since they sent more energy back than they consumed, they are compensated at the avoided power cost. The current avoided power cost for MLNP is 2.9 cents per kilowatt hour. And so that's why they have negative $4 that technically MLNP is paying them. And in this case, it's just used to offset the customer charge. I've seen similar bills from the other utilities as well, and they all look relatively similar with the same type of information. Next slide, please. So when we look at the rail belt, the entire rail belt, starting with GVA all the way down to Homer in the south, one of the things that ACEP has been doing since about 2015 is recording the information that is in the annual RCA filings that the different utilities are required to file, and then we try and disseminate that to interested stakeholders, which brings us here. So everything I'm going to present is just public information, and it can be found on the RCA's website. What we try to do is just get it in a form that's a little bit more digestible. At the end of 2019, which is the most recent data that is available, there was over 5,600 installed kilowatts of net metered renewable energy on the grid. This was a 74% increase from the previous year. And then as of the end of 2019, there were over 1,100 net metered individual customers. You can see the vast majority of these, over 1,000, were solar PV, with some other types of generation as well, number of wind turbines, and then some combined wind and PV as well. Next slide, please. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. This is how the installed capacity has grown over time, and this is Railbelt Wide. You can see that from 2010 to about 2014 and 15, the growth was pretty linear. And then starting in 2015, that growth really started to increase almost exponentially. A couple things started to happen in that time period. Tax credits continued to be available. So up until last year, there was a 30% tax credit available for installed solar. That's since decreased 20%. But the real thing that caused this is the price of solar really plummeted. The price of panels plummeted. And the installed cost of solar on the Railbelt ranges from probably, for rooftop residential solar, ranges from about $2.75 per watt up to $3.50 a watt, depending upon the size of the system, where it's installed, these type of things. It might get a little bit more expensive than that, but that's kind of a general guide. So I'm going to start in the north, and I'm just going to present some of this data, starting with GVA and then all the way down to Homer, just so we can kind of get an idea of where the different utilities stand as a way to guide this discussion. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So Golden Valley Electric, utility obviously that serves the Fairbanks region. At the end of 2019, they had 1,460 kilowatt hours of installed net metered capacity. This was 74% of that 1.5% threshold. The 1.5% threshold at the end of 2019 was 1,969 kilowatt hours. I should say I was on the RCA website yesterday, and I noticed that there was a brand new filing from the RCA that they had approved a raise to 3%. So the new limit for GVA would be almost 4,000 kilowatts of installed capacity there. At the end of 2019, they had 274 customers, 274 net metered customers. Of these, they were almost all PV, 6 had wind, and then all of the added capacity in 2019 was through solar. Next slide. And here's what the curve looks like for them. You can see it's been a pretty consistent increase over the years. Next slide. For Matanuska Electric, serving Palmer and Wasilla area. At the end of 2019, they had 1,002 installed kilowatts of net metered capacity. They were at 81% of their 1.5% threshold. The total customers are 174 that have solar PV, 21 with wind turbines, and then they have 8 customers that use both solar and wind. Everything added in 2019 was solar PV. Next slide, please. And here's what their graph really looks like. You can see that starting in 2016, they really started to see some steep increases in their net metered capacity. Again, as you've seen, pretty much all directly related to the installation of solar. Next slide. Municipal Light and Power in Anchorage. At the end of 2019, they had 909 installed kilowatts of capacity. They're 58% of the way to their 1.5% threshold, and they have 84 customers with solar, and then 1 customer with some wind power that they've added. Next slide. And you can see that they actually started off a little bit slow, and starting in 2017, they started to see some really big increases. A lot of this is due to the Solarize campaign, or the various Solarize campaigns that first started in Airport Heights in 2017, I think. I'm blanking on that. And then last year, there was Solarize campaigns in both Rogers Park and Turnagain, both which were in the MLNP, or not Turnagain, South Edition, both of which were in the MLNP service region. Next slide. Chugach Electric, kind of the same story. There's over 1,000 kilowatts of installed net metered capacity. They are 57% of the way to that 1.5% threshold. They have 248 customers with solar PV and then 3 with wind turbines. Everything added in 2019 was solar. Next slide. They're a little bit similar to MLNP. You can see that since the Solarize campaigns have started in the last couple of years, they've seen some big increases in their capacity. Next slide. And last but certainly not least, Homer Electric. down at the southern end of the rail belt. At the end of 2019, they had 1,224 kilowatts of installed net metering capacity. This is actually well over the 1.5% threshold. But at the beginning of 2019, they raised their net metering threshold to 3%, which equates to 1,520 kilowatts based upon last year's numbers. Currently, they have 2,210 customers with solar PV, 32 with wind turbines, and then they actually added one customer last year that has some generation from biofuel. Next slide. And Homer is interesting because really in the last 2.5 years is when they've seen their greatest gains. They also have a couple solarized campaigns down on the Kenai this year in HEA territory. So undoubtedly they'll see some large gains this year as well. Next slide. That's what I have from the numbers perspective. I'm happy to answer any questions. Although I should say if there's utility specific questions, there's a couple members representing different utilities with us here, and they're probably the best to answer those. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Chris. It's always amazing to see those slides, just how many people have engaged in renewable energy, especially recently with solar panels in specific. It seems like such a it's not so much on the public consciousness, but I love to see how much this is increased through Alaskan community specifically. So thank you again, Chris. All right, moving forward, if there are no more questions, there's actually 2 questions for you, I think, Chris. Maybe.
Sure, do you want to read them?
Yeah, so question 1 is, what is the average electricity in kilowatt used by a home of 4 people? And David Thomas would like to answer this question live. We will get to that by Q&A. The second question is the grid in the Railbelt region connected? And yeah, we can also answer that during Q&A if that works. Great. First, let's do an introduction. So we have 2 panelists here today, David Thomas and Gary Newman from Homer Electric Association and Golden Valley Electric Association. If you notice through the slides, these 2 electric associations were the 2 pioneers of voluntary raising of their own net metering caps, which means they allowed double the amount of capacity for people who are installing renewable energy to join in on this program, which is awesome. And I'm really happy to have them here. David and Gary, would you like to continue your introduction and introduce yourselves? Starting with Gary.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm Gary Newman. I kind of represent the east side of Fairbanks, but when we serve on the board, we serve the entire association. We go from Cantwell down on the Parks Highway all the way around to Delta on the Richardson Highway. So it's more than just Fairbanks. We actually at one point ran the utility in Barrow, and we're looking at Fort Yukon too. A little bit of ancient history, but right now we're just essentially along the rail belt and then down to Delta. Golden Valley started out with not a net metering program, but we started out with something called Sustainable Natural Alternatives program, which was essentially just buying power from people who wanted to generate from renewables. And we just called that SNAP. And that started in 2005, and I went back to the old board minutes when that was approved, and nobody had any real problem with it. And finally, when it looked like the regulatory commission was going to mandate net metering, we basically created SNAP Plus, and that became the net metering program. The SNAP program was primarily asking for volunteers in membership to donate toward those members who wanted to generate renewable energy. And then at the end of the year, they would figure out who generated the most and then rebate that amount back to the individual members. And it was originally pretty high return on that until the more people got on, and then it was kind of diluted by the more. On top of that, then they got avoided costs, which Chris talked about a little earlier. So I'll wait for the rest of the questions and let Dave go.
Excellent. Dave?
All right, thank you, Gary. I'm a HA director and vice president. My day job is as an environmental engineer, cleaning up contaminated soil and groundwater. In the 1980s, I installed 80 solar systems back when there were federal and state tax credits, in coastal states, for thermal solar systems. And next week, Alaska Solar will be bolting 7 kilowatts of photovoltaics to my own roof here in Kenai. Similar to Golden Valley, and actually not too many months behind them, we also implemented a SNAP program where members could voluntarily fund renewable energy generators, and I participated in that, but not very many members did. And then I believe we were the first in the state to voluntarily start a net metering program, and we were also the first to go beyond the required 1.5% capacity net metering to 3%. We'll blow through that in a few weeks, and it is my expectation that we will expand that again. For those who follow statewide issues, I would point out that it is subject to RCA approval. Unfortunately, democratically controlled member elected directors can't do what they feel the membership wants and needs, like your city council can, without RCA approval. But it's my expectation that as a board, we would attempt to expand net metering again, and then it lands in the RCA's lap. Thank you.
All right. Thank you both. Already touching down on some questions that I have. I appreciate it. All right. Well, so before we move any further, I do want to address a question in the chat, which is, what is the RCA? Yeah. Do you want to cover that since you touched on that, David?
Yeah, Regulatory Commission of Alaska. This is a semi-judicial commission appointed by the governor, approved by the Senate, 5 members who have to have a law license or engineering background, and Golden Valley, Chugach, Homer Electric are regulated utilities. This is unusual in the United States. Most democratically governed cooperatives are not subject to a state board, but they are in Alaska. Kodiak and Copper Valley have removed themselves from that with a majority vote of their members, but the Railbelt utilities are still subject to that. And so anything we charge a member, new service fee, cost of power, bounce check fee, anything we put on the bill has to be approved by them. I'm not a huge fan of this process, might become clear. And of the 51 jurisdictions in the United States, they have the longest mandated response time. They can take up to 450 days for some topics to respond to requests. So it is some sand in the gears, but that's the process we have now. That any charge, any regulation, any tariff between a utility and its members has to go through 5 folks from Anchorage to be blessed.
Well, that said, let's move into some of the meat of our Q&A. All right, so I believe Gary talked about this before, and so did David. So let's go to describe how both of your utilities, Golden Valley and Homer, have implemented net metering, where it is now, and if there were any hesitations in these decisions. And if so, how did boards address this and work through any problems that were seen?
I can go first if you like. When we first looked at the SNAP program, the idea was, as are many utilities, is cost causer, cost payer. So we wanted to make sure that it was not going to adversely impact all members if whatever program we implemented. And so there really wasn't any hesitation because it was essentially at retail, not at retail rate, but at avoided cost with our original program. And then the members that wanted to contribute could do so. There is a little bit of a concern at if it became so ubiquitous that it was really a sizable part of our generation, what the policy would be. When we talk right now at what the cost is at retail rate, which is basically spinning your meter backwards until you get to that avoided cost, that really, there is a little bit of subsidy, but we're at like 0.4%. And the impact on the membership overall is not that great. So at this point, it hasn't been a major part of the discussion. I would just point out that while you might say that the 1.5% or the 3% that we've gone to seems like a lot, that's nameplate. That's not necessarily what it produces. It's really producing, somewhere between 6 and 15% of that for each of the solar units. So it's not that large of an impact. Dave might want to chime in some more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the first 2 points we've kind of already discussed, but on the hesitations, what at the board table might cause someone to not support net metering at all or expanding it. I've observed that sometimes there's our anti-green directors, I would say, ones who park their diesel truck across a Tesla charging station just to do that, and that comes across in the votes. There are concerns by some directors that the subsidization by non-net metering members of net metering members, by giving net metering members that break on paying for the capacity of the system, the poles, the wires, the transformers, the fixed costs, that they pay less on than traditional members do. Economic justice issues, because I'm an engineer, my wife's a physician, we can afford to put photovoltaics on our roof. A lot of our members can't afford that. And two more maybe nuanced things. Compared to 10 years ago, 10 years ago, I would have made more of an argument for early adopters, that there is value to all members if some members take that first step, who are the pioneers with the arrows in their back and prove out or don't prove out a new technology. And data gathering, 12 years ago, we were running around putting in our own, the utility was putting in wind gathering data stations and looking at solar insolation values around our region. Well, I mean, now we have hundreds of members who do that for us. We can pull up any of their records and see that capacity factors are right around 10%, and use that data for utility planning purposes and consolidate that data and make it available for members. So early adopter benefits and data gathering benefits are less true now because we have that in hand. That would be the hesitations I see around the board table at this point.
Excellent. You guys have touched on to the next two questions are segued into it really well. So Gary had mentioned that this 3% is not as high as it could be. And in reality, it's a little different than what's on paper per se. So David, you also mentioned that there is definitely a possibility for further increases. I would like to tweak this question a bit. At what point do you see, there's this big question in the renewable energies community of like, at what point does net metering not become effective anymore? Or at what point will there be like pushback against it? Have your boards discussed this at all in depth before?
We've looked at it a little bit, and in my mind, the next step is easy. We expand the system, we double the allowance again. And to segue on Gary's thoughts, when we say 3% capacity factor, that's like 0.3% energy. So we're approaching 1/300th of the energy on our system being renewable, not 3% of the energy, because our gas turbine runs 95% of the time. The solar panels only run about 10% of the time. And that actually has been an argument around the board table to let net metering expand, because it is at this point still de minimis. One effect it'll have on our system in particular is as people use less power, because appliances are more efficient and lighting is more efficient, and as they go to more renewable net metering, our traditional generation assets become a little less efficient, a little less fuel efficient, and we use a little more natural gas to generate each kilowatt hour. So that's one point of concern. Different systems might have different concerns in that regard. And then when we're saying we're going to cost shift from our lower income traditional users to our higher income net metering members, we're moving money from one membership, part of the membership, to another, and it's a 300th of the energy. Well, okay, who cares? And member choice is always good. When that gets more significant, then those economic justice issues start to concern more people. But in the meantime, I see an evolution on the board. I see the anti-green component terming out or getting voted out. I see some individual directors evolving on these concepts. An individual director might have voted one way a decade ago, voting more towards renewable energy now. So I think we'll continue to expand for some years to come. And we don't, an issue in Alaska, unlike Phoenix, is we have to build as much generation as we need on a dark, windless January night. That determines what we build. And if you're in Phoenix and you've got solar producing and offsetting air conditioning load during their peak, there's capacity savings to solar in a hot climate that there isn't in our cold climate. So we just being in Alaska, we have some different constraints than in the Sun Belt.
Yeah, I'll add to that. You know, at the point when it becomes so large that it starts to affect our ability to regulate, we're actually already working on that right now, because we've got a pretty good sized wind farm, and we've got a 0.56 megawatt solar farm, and we're looking at what it would take to expand that. So it's a matter of trying to be able to not only have the reserve capacity, but as the intermittent type renewables, such as solar and wind, become more significant in our bailiwick, if you will, then we need to be able to have that backed up. And so there, you could look at batteries, you can look at sort of generation that you can turn up and down. When you take a generator that's on standby at a very low rate, its heat rate is terrible. It's not very efficient. It's best used much like you would your boiler system if you have one at home. It's best used when it's up to near its capacity. It's the most efficient. So those are the sorts of things we're looking at it in the larger scope of our generation mix. And at this point, the net metering thing, when we looked at the 3% last January, we were shown, well, look, here's where it's headed. The solarized Fairbanks was taken off. We just says, well, it looks like we're going to need to, and we just did it. There was really no pushback at all. And so that was kind of refreshing. Interesting, going back to some of the original concerns over net metering, are probably our most conservative member on the board was saying, how come the directors can't participate in this program because of some arcane thing in the bylaws that says that we can't sell power to the electricity to the co-op, because that would be a conflict. And so we're trying to even look at some little micro stuff like that that would tend to discourage that. You know, and I just think it's not really a major issue for us at this point. And I guess we get on to the next question.
All right. I'm going to ask the last question of the moderated section, then move on to audience Q&A for 10 minutes, since it seems like I don't have that many. First, let's see. We've talked about how it has impacted communities, but a common criticism of net metering is that, like David said, it's only accessible to people with capital and people who can initially purchase big renewable energy projects for their home, or big for a personal budget, have you. So what are your ideas on making net metering a tool for more access to renewable energies for low-income communities, communities that historically haven't been able to engage in renewables?
One thing that Homer Electric did that was pretty easy, and I think we didn't even need to go to the RCA on this, but we have long had a line of credit program in which members could borrow money. And decades ago, this was about selling them an electric water heater or an electric oven or something that would use electric power and make the cooperative more economically stable and viable and reduce energy costs. So into our line of credit program, we rolled renewable energy products and installations. So if one were to apply for that, one could borrow up to $5,000 towards the installation of a photovoltaic system, just as they could towards a new widescreen TV. And then there's on-bill financing, and they just pay, you know, with the rest of their electric bill, presumably offset by some of their savings. So tweaking our line of credit program to allow for electric vehicles, to allow for heat pumps, to allow for any renewable energy system was one pretty easy thing that we could do.
Sweet deal. Thank you.
You know, from Golden Valley's perspective, we also used to have, going back in the 60s, we actually had an appliance store trying to sell electric appliances to members so that we could increase our demand. We did get pushback from vendors who felt we were competing with them, and it only lasted 4 or 5 years. We've been hearing a lot from our membership about on-bill financing, and a lot of on-bill financing concept that was approved by the legislature was ability basically to add to your electric bill the payment of loans from whatever source of funding. And some of the concerns were, well, if somebody didn't pay their loan back, we would have to cut off their electricity. And so there would be definitely an effort to make sure that people were credit worthy to be able to not have a very high default rate. And in other states where this has been done, it has been successful. There's some federal money coming through the Department of Agriculture called RESP, and I forget what the acronym is, maybe Dave remembers, but where we could actually have a line of credit from the federal government and turn to loan to the membership for up to 5% cost. Basically, the idea is defer whatever our administrative costs are. There's probably about 6 months to get something like that going. So at the last board meeting, we encouraged management to look at using some of our equity that won't affect what members' rates are of $100,000, and try to figure out a way to make that work and see what we wanted to fund within that scope of within the very wide scope of potentials under the RASP funding. One thing I will want to point out that our push for what our half megawatt solar system was originally for a community solar system that we had investigated, and we'd asked for a number of proposals and centered on one that was actually responsive. But every time we went a little step further to allow make this happen, they kept raising our what we would get for a 20-year a cost of roughly almost 19 to 20 cents a kilowatt. And that's just the cost of energy. And that's why we ended up just doing our own. We may actually look at doing it again with a little bit more experience behind us. And so that would allow people basically to buy their solar in small increments. And then Golden Valley would operate it. And there would be essentially a little power purchase agreement for that. But the on-bill financing was a big push for that was actually to help people convert from oil to natural gas with the interior gas utility project. And they're just trying to get to the point of actually providing expansion of that system. It's been a really hard fought effort, but Golden Valley may be able to take advantage of it as well as other utilities.
Okay. Thank you both for answering these moderated questions. Let us move on to very quickly some audience questions that haven't been addressed yet. I guess starting at 148, are all the utilities on the Railbelt except for MLMP co-ops? And Chris, do you want to field this?
They are, with the exception of MLMP, and then the Seward utility is owned by the city of Seward.
Okay. If you have further questions, then you can continue to ask them. Oh, sorry. I see somebody did. And then for Dave, if you want to vocally answer this, is HEA considering adopting the RESP funding to expand their existing on-bill financing credit line? Dave, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry. That came before us earlier this year as a board. It went down 4-5, kind of along party lines. We've had a board election since. Personally, I'm debating about bringing it up again because we had a seat change. So not currently, but maybe we'll re-examine that.
Okay. And then for Chris, has there been any research into what the maximum penetration of distributed renewables into the rail belt would be before utilities see problems with reliability or cost recovery? And then follow up, if so, how does this maximum penetration relate to net metering caps?
Well, that's a big question.
Yeah.
I think that right there, that's the $1 million question is, number one, how much, not just net metering, but renewable energy in general could be integrated into the rail belt. And that's dependent upon the type of generation and transmission that we have, whether or not We have additional storage that that comes online. I know that Homer has been investigating a Tesla battery to help us.
Homer has committed to install a Tesla
Oh, look
battery.
at that. Perfect. Yeah. When's that supposed to happen, David?
There was an issue on warm storage for the winter, so we end up bumping it 9 months. So we believe it will be coming online in 2021.
Great. So I would say that there's constantly research going on into that. I don't have a specific number about what that is. The cost recovery is kind of a related but slightly separate issue, you know, because there's the technical aspect, but then there's the cost aspect as well. And there's been some, people are constantly talking about different types of rate structures that would improve the equity of the cost recovery and that kind of stuff. And it looks like David has some to add.
In general, first off, net metering systems at this point are down in the weeds and really a de minimis issue. On the larger installations, solar tends to have less impact on the grid, both because it is predictable, like the sun never shines at midnight, and the ramp rate is slower. It doesn't just shut off instantly. Whereas wind, commercial scale wind farms, like 25 megawatts or so, and Golden Valley has much more issues and litigation on these points. They are bigger installations. They are far less predictable than solar. And the ramp rate is very fast. They might come online with a lot of megawatts. They might drop offline very quickly and leave all the other assets of the system, the gas assets and the hydro assets, to make up for that. When you cycle the gas assets, it's like driving down the freeway, stomping on the gas pedal and letting off. Fuel efficiency goes down. And none of our hydro facilities, particularly Bradley Lake, ramp very quickly. So yeah, it's some spin and yeah, it's some backup, but it's not quick enough. It's not, I mean, a Tesla battery can respond in a cycle in a 60th of a second. Bradley Lake Power, the biggest hydro facility in the state, in some ways is a battery, but it's a slow to adjust battery. And so that's where a lot of the contention on wind comes, is these integration costs. Who pays that? When your fuel consumption goes up, or you're spilling water, or you have these other economic impacts, does the wind developer pay that, or does the membership of a cooperative pay that? And that's sometimes what prevents a large wind installation from going in, is not being able to come to terms on those issues.
So we only have 5 minutes left, and I would love to hear your answer. Would you be able to type it up in the chat, Gary? I would, because we only have 5 minutes left. We may have to move on to the next part of the presentation. Go ahead.
Let me have one minute, if you will. You know, one of the biggest challenges that we've had is being able to integrate the Railbelt transmission network, and we now have the Railbelt Reliability Council that's supposed to be kind of putting the beginning pieces of that together, so that if we need some reliability, some regulation from somewhere else because we can't ramp up as efficiently, then the Railbelt can coordinate more. And I would ask Dave real quickly, is if you see the deficits with wind farm.
Did we lose Gary?
Yeah, I didn't catch
that. That's it. Thanks. Oh, I was saying, if we have 4 additional pads that can have wind generation on them at Eva Creek, and I'd heard that Homer might be interested in those.
I know we've looked at wind from your service area, and I know we've looked at swapping wind for water. What typically comes up is reserving capacity on the interties on the grid. We weirdly in Alaska only charge for energy to be moved across the system, and we don't charge for capacity. And so we get some very skewed economics and politics around that, where one entity will block the sale. Say Homer wants to sell cheap energy to Fairbanks, but somebody in the middle that doesn't want competitive bids on that. So our practice of not charging for capacity on our grid creates these uneconomic issues, as well as sometimes precludes doing renewable energy transfers in ways that would otherwise make sense. So I'd like to see us charge less for energy and more for capacity, so that all of these issues could just go away. It would just become a pocketbook issue instead of arm wrestling in front of the RCA.
Fully agreed. Thank you.
Okay, we've talked about a lot of things today. And now I want to talk about next steps, especially for audience members. Kengo, can you pull up the slide starting with get involved? Basically, there's right now 3 ways I can point you to get involved with so many of these interesting and obviously very poignant topics. The first is to vote. Board members are voted in these co-ops. While Homer and GVA already had their voting period, Chugach Electric is voting right now. They will be voting quite soon. Second, utility meetings. The next Chugach meeting is on the 15th. Golden Valley is on June 22nd. Homer Electric is June 14th. This is a great way to get in the know about what folks are talking about. Third, we'll be sending out a general talking point and what we've learned here today on Tuesday. You can either use that to write an op-ed to send to the Alaska Energy Transparency Project or to a local paper, or you can write it about any topic in utilities. It's awesome. Anyway, moving forward, here's the general voting information. Kengo, if you can hop 2 slides, the next one. So deadlines for Chugach electronic voting is June 15th at 4 p.m. The physical ballot is tomorrow at 12 p.m. And take note, they need to receive it. Kengo, can you go to the next slide? So for electronically voting, they will send your ballot to your email if you're a Chugach Electric member, the one that is listed under my account, which I've circled for you at the right. So check that if you haven't already. Next, if you want to do your physical voting, if you have received a physical ballot, then you need to make sure folks get it, or Chugach Electric gets it by 12 p.m. tomorrow. That means you'd have to bring it to the ballot box in the lobby. However, they're still under COVID restrictions. So, or I think they are. Call ahead at 563-7633. Next slide. Again, deadlines are June 15th, electronically by 4 p.m., physical tomorrow at 12 p.m. If you have any issues at all, call customer service at 563-7366. Now, let's move on to Ben Betzger, who's going to tell us a little bit more about that op-ed submission possibility. And thank you all for coming. Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you, Shanelle. So I'm the editor of the Alaska Energy Transparency Project, which is an energy journalism initiative that the Alaska Public Interest Research Group is launching. I was for several years a reporter for the Kenai Peninsula's local newspaper, the Peninsula Clarion. I covered local government and energy, so I reported on both the Kenai City Council and Homer Electric Association, and it was interesting to see the way that that those 2 groups were similar in some ways and different in others. And with the Alaska Energy Transparency Project, could you go to the next slide, Ken go? Thanks. So with the Alaska Energy Transparency Project, we're sort of aiming to do energy journalism that that kind of brings those 2 reporting styles together. And this slide really shows you sort of the thesis of the project, that Alaskans have a rare opportunity for democratic participation in the energy system, which is really underlies every part of modern life. So I'm going to elaborate a bit on how we think participation-focused energy journalism can help us realize this opportunity. Next slide, please. If you follow the news, you know that there's no shortage of great energy journalism in Alaska. The Alaska Public Media has a whole sort of section devoted to it, Alaska's Energy Desk. The ADN and the Alaska Journal of Commerce do good energy journalism, but there's not a lot that focuses on co-ops as democratic institutions. These co-ops, the Railbelt's 4 co-ops, are led by member-elected boards. They deliberate in public meetings, but it's very rare to see dedicated coverage of co-op elections, or tracking of voting records, or quotes from co-op directors in the newspaper, even in stories about energy. Co-ops are usually covered primarily as economic actors. Journalists like to write about their relations with each other, with state regulators, with gas suppliers and other economic entities. But this is an important part of what they are, but it's not the totality of what co-ops are. And focusing strictly on those aspects of them sort of tends to kind of shrink the material that we have to think about longer term issues. It puts the focus on sort of what's immediate and obvious in economic terms, and it doesn't give us a lot to think about in terms of issues like sustainability and economic justice. The Alaska Energy Transparency Project really kind of aims to fill this space. Next slide, please. We base our editorial standards on local government reporting more than energy, more than business journalism. So we want to report on meetings, and as David Thomas alluded to, co-op boards aren't exactly like city councils. There are other constraints on them. He mentioned the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, and in our coverage will include that aspect too, and it'll put the co-op boards in their legal and economic context. But we want our coverage to be more inward looking at the decision-making process, which means we'll emphasize voting records. We'll feature quotes from directors from their public meetings, and include interviews with directors whenever possible on their thinking behind their decision-making process. So where you come into this is if you've been interested by the great discussion we've been listening to, and you want to get more of it, you can listen to this kind of talk every month at your co-op's board meetings. So really, you can see this page on our website at the Alaska Energy Transparency Project. The address will be in the next slide. We're looking for volunteers to contribute coverage of your co-op board meeting. So you can look up when and where that is on your co-op's website. And if you want to report on the meeting, you can contact me. I'm the editor of the website. My address is there on this slide. And we have a set of new standards for accuracy, specificity, attribution that'll help you shape your writing towards. And once we fact check it, we'll publish it on our website in the news section at akenergytransparency.org. So I hope you found this interesting, and if you want to get in touch with me, again, my email address is right there on the slide. So thank you, and for those of you in Chugach and GBA territory, don't forget to vote. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, we'll be sending out as much information as possible in a follow-up email to attendees. I really appreciate all of you attending and all of our panelists and Chris, Ben for joining us and giving us our energy. I do want to honor that it's 2:07, so if you need to go, by all means, leave. And wrapping final thoughts, this is like a really niche topic, and it's can get in the weeds really fast, like we definitely saw today. And it can be kind of hard to conceptualize as connecting it back to these big issues. But through these smaller, like lesser known informational sections, we can all like make local changes and local differences, which is pretty much the place we have the most power. So thank you all again for attending, and I really appreciate you. Thanks, and goodbye.